Hi guys, we're going to make another stacked project today, and it is going to be composed of 3 parts. And instead of just making a generic cylinder and using that cylinder to create a form, we're actually going to create the form, or at least the start of the form, with the shape of the pieces that we make. So the concept is we're going to have a bowl that flares out, a bowl that flares back in, and a cylinder that goes up from there. So we're going to have basically like a rounded base with a narrow neck. Think very cartoonish bottle shape. And once we get that together, we can then change the shape somewhat, modify it, refine it. But this is a really nice technique. If you've never stacked before, you don't have to create very precise joints. It's a thing we do with kids in summer camp. So I think it's really accessible and enjoyable, and I hope you'll follow with me through the steps and we'll make it together. Okay, we're going to make this pot from the top down. So I'm going to start with the smallest piece of clay I'm going to use for this project, and this is, let's call it 1.75 pounds. I think that's about where it is. And I'm going to throw the narrow cylinder that will form the neck of this bottle-like vase that we're making. So let's go ahead and center it up. I don't have to think very much about this part because it's the top of the stack. So I could make it thin. I won't make it thin because I want to be able to manipulate it while it's wet and not worry about it. So I'm going to leave it thicker than I would for a normal pot, but a little bit less stress on this part. So let's just open down to the wheel head, make our classic bottomless cylinder. So there we are at the wheel head. We're going to draw out about 3 inches. Let's go 3.5. The reason I say that is I want to be able to reach down inside and get a hold of this seam. So if I make it too narrow, it's going to make my life more difficult. I can always collar it later. And then let's just bring this clay up. I can pull this, I can collar it, I can flare it, I can do all kinds of things once it's attached. So I'm not going to stress about it. I'm just going to kind of make raw material here. There it is. 2 poles, just nice and easy. Keep it simple. Now, this little extra clay here is your friend. A lot of times we're like, darn it, we got to cut that off. We're going to leave it there because it's going to give us extra surface area when we go to put everything together. There's also that little flare on the inside, and neither one of them is a problem. It's actually an asset. So I do want to take and use my ribs and dry everything off, because that is going to make picking it up and restacking it later a lot easier. A couple of passes just to scrape off all of that slurry. And I left a decent amount of clay at this lip. I'm going to just compress it to make sure I've got something that looks like a finishing statement for the top of this triple form. So I'm just supporting on either side and compressing with the side of my index finger. For adults, we tend to call that consolidating your rim. For children, we call it shushing the duck. So your left hand is a duck, quack, quack, quack. It grabs onto the rim at the front, and then you tell it shush with the side of your index finger. It's kind of a nice little way to remember how to do that. Okay, let's just get a little bit of this moisture away from the base, and I'm going to clean my hands and pull this off and set it aside, and we'll just jump right into the next segment of the pot. All right, I've got my hands clean and dry, so I'm ready to just wire this off and set it aside. Encircle it so it doesn't get distorted too much out of round. I'm going to set it right there and come back to it in a minute. And then let's just go ahead and make the middle component. The middle component is a bowl shape, but it is going to get inverted upside down to close the form back in. And so what's against the wheel needs to match the base of the piece that I just threw. The lucky thing about this technique is the degree to which it needs to match is a little more subjective. It's not it's not a precision operation the way it is when you're trying to make something that really needs to make an accurate joint. Because they're flat, sitting on flat, it's pretty easy to get it to work, just as long as they make contact with each other. We can close that seam. So I centered it to about the same width at the bottom, which is going to help get them to fit together. And again, we're just going to open all the way to the wheel head. There we are. We're going to draw out the same amount that we did on that first one. A, because it needs to fit, and B, because I need to be able to get my hand through that opening to shape the composite form. I'm going to pull this one mostly up, but I'm going to let it flare outward a little bit. Now this piece needs to bear the weight of that first cylinder, that extra 1 3/4 pounds of clay. So I don't want to get too wide or the whole thing can pancake down. I just want to start creating volume for the base of my piece. Even wall coming up and out. And then shushing the duck on this project is quite important, because this surface is going to mate with the surface of the third piece that I make. So it needs to be nice and flat, and it needs to be kind of a nice broad target. So I've just shushed the duck, or consolidated that rim nice and flat. I'm going to go ahead and pull all the water out of here. And I'm going to use the ribs again to dry and compress these walls. Got my nice yellow Cheryl mud tool on the inside and metal on the outside. And the first pass, I want to hold them almost perpendicular to the walls so that I am just scraping as much of that goop off of there as I can. And then subsequent passes, I can decrease the angle of attack, going at about a 45 to the wall, and that'll just kind of compress and smooth. So from above you can see that they're each 45 to the wall, 90 degrees to each other, and that leaves a really nice surface that's compressed and ready to go. While I've got this on the wheel, it's a convenient time to go ahead and score up this rim. So I'm going to use my scratcher tool and spin the wheel and just kind of jiggle my hand, get this all nice and rough. And I'll slow it down and do some little diagonal strokes. Make sure I don't miss any spots. It's just so much more convenient to do this when the pedal can assist moving the pot. All right, that looks pretty adequate. I am going to take my wooden knife and I'm going to remove just the water from the base of the pot. And I'm not finding my knife, so I'm going to use this rib. I don't want to take clay away. I want to leave that little flare. I want to get rid of all this goop that's on my bat. And I'm going to take another break, clean my hands, and come back and set this piece aside and make the third piece. Okay, I'm going to wire this off, and I like to spin the wheel so that it cuts in kind of evenly all the way around, and then you don't even have to go all the way through. You can just come back out the side you went in. And I'm going to stand up to pick this up because I want to get my hands around the base, and because it has no bottom, I'm going to be extra gentle. I'm going to just peel it up and set it over here on a board so that I'm ready for the next step. That last piece of clay was around 3 pounds. The first one was 1 3/4 pounds. It was the smallest. This one's probably 4 pounds because it's going to have a bottom in it, and we're going to make the base. And what we need to do now is basically figure out the diameter of the rim of the piece I just made, and we're going to shoot for the same diameter on this next bowl piece. So that's how you measure outside to outside, and I'll go outside to outside on this next one. So let's slap this down, get it centered, and we'll take off. This piece needs to be left thicker than the others because it has to hold up 2 extra friends on top. I also want to make sure that the base of this one is nice and narrow because that's going to give me this sort of drama of coming out from a narrow base and then going really wide. So I'm going to just open down. I'm only going to leave about 1/4 inch in the bottom. This isn't going to get trimmed. And I'm calling this a bowl, but because it's not going to be trimmed, it's actually going to be opened like a cylinder and then pulled like a bowl. All right, so we currently have 3/8 of an inch or so, so we're close. Just going to push down the rest of the way with my finger and do the opening step. I don't want to go too wide on this. Make sure that's all nice and compressed and flat. It'll be hard to work on once we have more pieces up top. And then we're going to get it nice and wet. And I'm going to pull it up and out. I've got that sponge in my right hand, and that's kind of handy because if I get dry on the way up, I can squeeze it and dispense a little bit of water and just finish the pull, and I don't have to stop, go to my bucket, and come back. So I like that little tip. You're gonna get it nice and juicy for the second pull. Stay down at the bottom for a minute and get a hold of that clay. Don't go crazy and make a thin spot, but you also don't need to leave tons of excess down there. Coming up, third pull is my last chance. Make sure I'm not leaving behind a really thick bottom down here. So I'm just going to take my finger and kind of scrape some of that clay away, and then leave the stout, thick clay at the base there where it's holding up the most weight. Okay, gonna compress my rim nice and flat. And then I like to just sort of see what I'm dealing with as far as diameter. So I'm gonna dry it out for a second and grab my calipers and just kind of see. I know I have to stretch it quite a bit, but only really about 1/2 inch on either side. So not too bad. Definitely go thinner first or narrower first, and stretch it to the size that you need. Trying to collar in a big bowl shape like that is no fun. Just gonna scrape it dry and compress everything. And I'm also coaxing it wider as I go. Scraping that stuff off on my bucket. All right, between those two stretches, I'm guessing that I'm approaching my diameter, but we don't have to guess. We've got calipers, so we're getting really close. It would meet at this point, but we might as well go ahead and make it as accurate as possible with just the understanding that we don't have to stress about it. Slow release so everything stays nice and round. And recheck. We're within 1/8 of an inch. Just a really gentle final stretch here. All right, I'm going to just take the flat of my rib and really press this top horizontal. It's like shushing the duck using the rib instead of the finger. And now, while I've got it here, I guess I'll give it a final check with the calipers. Yep, that is definitely within range. I'm going to grab my scratcher tool, which I just threw on the floor, and rough this up. Hard to find that first little bit of turn on the wheel. All right, excellent. So we're going to give our lovely camera person a break and come back and show you how to put this thing together. All right, at this point we have all three components of our composite form. We've got the cylinder that we started with, the bottomless bowl, and the bowl with a bottom. I have reserved judgment on whether I want to trim off this little excess at the bottom or whether I'm calling that an interesting feature. I can always cut it off later. This piece is scored, that piece is scored. So let me show you how to stack these things together. I'm going to stand up and put my hands upside down again and grab it around the base and flip it. And don't stop halfway, you just want to flip it right over. I'm looking down inside to line it up, and then I kind of lean back and see how it's looking. And I'm a little bit over on this side, so I'm going to just gently try to break that seam and come back towards me a little bit. All right, that looks like an even amount of overlap the whole way around, or at least what we call close enough. Okay, so you can see now why it was important for me to have this opening the size that it is, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to reach in here and seal this seam closed. And so I do this kind of funny thing when I'm trying to seal the seam. You know, I've got flat on flat. I don't really have any way other than gravity for that to mesh together. So I put my right hand where my fingers are flowing out in the direction the clay is going to be traveling away from me. And I'm going to get on either side of it, and it's going to be like I'm doing this slow pinch to try to push that seam closed. And that, while I'm doing that, I'm going to put the side of my index finger, or maybe the pad, against the inside of the seam. So I need to dampen my fingers just a little bit, and here we're going to go. So I'm getting around that seam and try to pinch it closed. You want to just kind of feel like it's getting compressed. Now I'm using kind of the pads of my fingers just to work over it. I don't want to stretch it out particularly, but I want to make sure that it's not going to pop open later. So I can feel it's pretty smooth on the inside. And now I'm going to just sort of stretch this profile a little bit on the upper part, which is going to allow me to come up and stabilize this edge. And picking it up, because it had no bottom, it got a little bit pushed out around. But the cool thing is I can come back in now and recenter that and go ahead and scratch this up. So we're going to just roughen this surface. And we're going to hope that the size of this opening matches the size of my top piece. I actually never measured that. I just eyeballed it, and it's the point of that really was to show you that you don't have to be exact. You can get away with a little bit of slop here. Okay, now I'm going to probably cheat a little bit and give my camera person a break and have her help me scratch the bottom. I can flip over my cylinder piece. If you're alone, just flip it over onto a piece of foam so that you can get it at the bottom and scratch it. But if you've got a lovely assistant, just lift it up and have the bottom scratched for you, and then you can put those two pieces together. So we'll be right back. All right, so the bottom has been scratched expertly, and now I'm going to lay this on top, and I'm just going to set it down for a second. You can see how far from fitting that is, but it's not like it's falling apart. So you have that leeway. You just want to have an even amount of excess on each side. So I'm going to pick that up and just slightly shift it so that I've got, it looks like maybe about 3/8 of an inch all the way around. And I can spin it to see if it's basically centered. And it is. Okay, so that's together, but let's look at it a little bit. You've got this extra flare of clay, which was left behind. That's there. There's an extra flare on the inside, and what I'm going to do is basically push the extra flare on the inside down and under, and I'm going to put this flare of clay up and over, so that it's going to, instead of just being flat to flat, it's going to kind of do like an S curve and join together really in a more secure way. So slight dampness to my fingers, reaching inside, and I'm just going to be pushing up on this part. And bringing that clay up. Now I'm keeping the side of my thumb against that edge because I don't want to trap a pocket of air when I fold that clay up. I just want to come up like this and smooth that all in. So the inside hand pushed the clay down and up underneath. So at this point, it is all together. It is not attractive, but it's all together. And so that seam is closed, it's compressed. When we look at the overall form, it's very obvious what this is. It's a bowl and a cylinder, and they're all stuck together. It wouldn't be quite so awkward if I'd actually measured that first cylinder, but let me show you what you do. Sometimes it's nice to make slight missteps when you're doing an instructional video so that you can teach actually what you do in real life when things go not quite according to plan. So we always think of this as a tool that's used at leather hard to trim, but you can also remove excess material while the clay is wet. So I'm just going to take a little worm of clay off of here, and then I'm going to stop the wheel and remove it. You can't quite trim the same way you would a leather hard pot because everything is getting stuck right back down. So you have to stop and peel the extra bits off. But that's going to get rid of a little bit of the bulk in that seam, which will be nice. One more goober over here. And so now the decision is, do you kind of just refine that and say this is a great composite form that looks like a composite form, it's made up of 3 components, or do we take this as kind of a raw material starting point and modify the shape into something that's a little bit more pleasing? I think the first time you try it, maybe just be happy with what you get from your composite. And then once you get more comfortable, you can get a little bit friskier with your modifications. So if I put a rib on there, kind of show you what it would look like if I just called this good enough, or the plan that I had. So I can just take the rib and smooth out that wet trim job. And it'll look pretty much like this cool composite shape. And sometimes I actually really like the way that looks. It's very sort of geometric. It looks like you just assembled pieces. But to be a little bit more educational, let's go ahead and show you what is possible. I want to not mess with the bottom section of this composite. I'm going to work this section right now and try to get a little bit more pleasing rounded shape so it doesn't just look like kind of Tinker Toys put together. So I'm going to go in with my friend, the yellow rib, and we're going to just expand this part here. Go in with it spinning so that if you bump the walls, nothing bad happens. And I'm going to support right where that seam is, and I'm going to go ahead and start trying to expand and change from kind of a concave shape, a concave profile, to a much more convex, voluminous shape through here. Go ahead and bring this out so that it's a little bit wider than my original join. And that sort of camouflages where the seam was. And if I stop there, you can already see the difference that just changing the shape of one of the components makes. It's quite cool. I'm just going to work on refining that for one more pass here. Reaching kind of down underneath and stretching out. Using the flat side of my rib to try to compress the seam. And I'm going to give myself a little bit of stretch below now. Flipping my rib back around. Starting to feel the top cylinder bind on my forearm, so I'm going to be really careful. Just round this out a little bit more. Now we're finally getting that seam to compress. I need to come out and clean everything off. I've got too much clay built up on all the working surfaces of this rib. But you can see now the bottom just looks like one continuous shape with this cool top. I'm kind of liking the detail that I've got here where the top cylinder meets the rest of the form. And I'm actually somewhat digging this little extra foot at the bottom. I'll refine that later. But leaning back, I'm getting a lot happier with the form. I'm going to go in and make one final sort of refinement. And I'm going to use the flat side of my rib, which is the dangerous side. I've got to kind of angle it so that I don't end up gouging it with a corner. So it can let me really bend this around the shape. And then when I get up here, I'm going to intentionally use the corner to define the seam up here. So I'm coming up with that corner and meeting. And creating a distinct mark there. So at this point, I want to just be done with the bottom. And I think if I were nervous about this, I would torch this, but it's feeling pretty stable. And confession time, I did torch it a little bit while we were off camera, so it's feeling nice and stable. I'm just going to finish off this top section. So the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of work it with the rib and think about what I want. And because I'm not going to mess with the bottom anymore, I think that frees me up to actually collar in this section narrower than what I can fit my hand inside. So I'm going to just dampen my hands a little bit, and I'm going to take the sponge and squeeze it almost all the way out, but I'm just going to run a little bit of water on this section of it and try not to drip it down below. And I'm going to collar this thing in. Create something that doesn't look quite so deadly dull and boring, and I like that. I think we're on the right track. So I'm just going to kind of clean it up with the ribs. Always cleaning them off. Stick that curved part down into that curve that I just created. Come around that nice shape. And then the only thing that's really left is dealing with the rim. Right now that rim is really boring. So I want to have that expand out and flare just a little bit. Going back and redefining that edge. It's amazing how challenging sometimes it is to get just a crisp mark right where you want it. But that's what I'm going to call crisp and good. And now I'm going to take the chamois over my rim, because it's been sitting out here in the nice weather and it's gotten a little stiff. So I'm going to use the chamois over my fingers to give me a little extra slip. Slipperiness, not slip like wet clay. Just give this a little bit of a terminal flare and compress it. And I like that little extra kick out at the top. So I come up underneath it one little pass with the rib, clean it up. And then slow release. And we'll just refine this foot a little bit. I'll probably come back when this piece is leather hard and work on that foot a little, but I'm going to leave that extra flare of clay. Very often I like these forms to just sort of spring from the ground, but I think this one, because it's so big and so wide and the foot is fairly narrow, I think if I went ahead and cut that off, it would probably make it look unstable and maybe actually be unstable. So that's it. That's a 3-part composite form. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.